Jack had been a truck driver for 10 years and knew all the roads like the back of his hand. The night shift was a routine matter. He had crossed the endless deserted highways of America many times when the whole world was asleep. Today was a special shift. All his colleagues were on the road, too. Ken, Marty, and Joe, old friends with whom he had worked for a long time in the same company, connected one after another on the radio. They were transporting cargo from different cities to one point, a warehouse on the outskirts of a small town. The cargo was unremarkable, but everything seemed so ordinary that no one even asked unnecessary questions about the contents of the containers. "How are you, Jack?" Ken's familiar voice rang out on the radio, slightly hoarse from cigarettes. "Everything's fine, Ken. It's just started raining. It's flooding the road," Jack answered, peering into the night sky. Raindrops were hitting the windshield, turning the landscape outside the window into a blurry picture. "Here too. The weather is crap, but it's okay. There are only a few hours left until the warehouse," Ken replied. Marty and Joe were also in touch, exchanging short phrases, jokes, as usual. They had known each other for a long time and had already delivered cargo to the same point more than once. But after a couple of hours, when Jack had already begun to get used to the monotonous noise of the rain and the conversation on the radio, the connection with Ken was suddenly cut off. "Ken? Can you hear me?" Jack switched channels, but there was no answer. Marty and Joe also noticed his disappearance. They began calling out to each other, trying to figure out what had happened. "Maybe his antenna just broke, or he turned into a gas station," Joe suggested. "Yeah, that's probably it," Marty said, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. The hours dragged on, and everyone tried to concentrate on the road, but something was pressing on their nerves. Jack felt some inexplicable anxiety thickening around the truck. Then Marty stopped responding. Jack tried to call him again, but to no avail. "Joe, are you in contact with Marty?" Jack asked, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. "No, buddy, he's gone too." Joe's voice sounded more tense. The minutes dragged on like hours. Jack turned off the main highway onto a secondary road leading through the forest. It was the last stretch of road before the warehouse, but the silence on the radio became unbearable. Another half-hour passed, when Joe stopped responding too. Jack was already beginning to realize that something was wrong. He tried to explain it all away to himself as random breakdowns or technical problems, but deep down he knew that something was wrong. He was left alone. Everything around him had gone dark. The headlights of the truck snatched only rain and trees from the darkness, and the road was becoming narrower and more winding. Suddenly, the truck's engine died. It stopped abruptly in the middle of the road. Jack cursed and tried to start the engine again, but the truck didn't respond. He stepped out of the cab, feeling the cold wind that was raising small drops of rain into the air. It was unusually quiet around him. There was not a single sound, only the sound of his own breathing. As Jack walked around the truck to look under the hood, he noticed something strange. The wind was blowing the back doors of the trailer to the side, as if they were not completely locked. He was sure that he had closed them tightly when he pulled out. Something inside him made him go to them. "Hey, Joe. Marty, if you're here, this is not funny," he muttered quietly, realizing the absurdity of the situation. He opened the door of the trailer. It was dark inside, but in the light of the headlights he noticed an object wrapped in burlap, lying right on the floor. Jim's heart began to beat faster. He didn't know what it was, but something told him it was best not to touch it. However, curiosity got the better of him. Jack carefully unfolded the burlap and froze in place. In front of him lay a human hand. Shock paralyzed him, and he took a step back, almost stumbling. "This can't be true. This is a dream. This is a goddamn nightmare," flashed through his mind. But just as he was about to close the doors, something in the silence changed. Footsteps were heard. First far away, then closer. Jack turned around, but in the darkness, he could see nothing. Fear paralyzed him, and then those steps again, slow, confident, approaching him. He returned to the cabin and locked the doors, trying to calm down. Suddenly, a voice came over the radio. But it was neither Joe, nor Ken, nor Marty. It was a woman's voice, cold, empty. "Do you know what you're carrying?" the voice said. "You were the last." Jack clutched the radio, his hands shaking, but he couldn't answer. The voice continued. "Each container had a part. You should have guessed. Now it's your turn." The radio went silent, and Jack felt the truck start shaking again, as if something or someone was moving inside it. His mind spun, wondering what it all meant. He tried to figure out why they had all disappeared and what these body parts were. The answer came unexpectedly. They were all carrying parts of the same body. Different trucks, different roads, but the same goal. Someone or something had carefully put it all together to return what was lost. And now it was his turn. He was carrying the last part. Jack didn't have time to do anything. Suddenly headlights appeared in front of the truck. It was another truck, heading straight for him. He slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car swerved sharply, and everything around him went dark. The last thing he heard was the same cold voice on the radio. "You were the last one." Night had enveloped the world in its dark blanket. The moonlight barely penetrated the clouds, creating bizarre shadows on the road. Alex, an experienced truck driver, was accepting another order to transport cargo. He had long been accustomed to night trips and unpredictable routes, but this order seemed strange even by his standards. No details about the cargo, only confidentiality. The navigator's screen showed the final destination, but Alex didn't remember a single familiar place. He sighed and clenched his hands on the steering wheel, deciding that this was just another cargo that he had to deliver. He was paid well, and that was it. As he drove along the dark highways, silence swallowed him. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the shaking of the truck. From time to time, he glanced at the navigator, which stubbornly showed the route, but there were no signs or familiar landmarks along the road. "Turn left in 5 miles," said a female voice, as if it had just burst out of a forgotten past. Alex was surprised. Turning left, he entered a narrow road surrounded by tall trees that seemed alive, darkened by the dim light of the headlights. The foliage moved, as if someone invisible was watching him. He slightly drew his legs up, trying not to think that this was just his imagination. A few hours passed, and the fog enveloped the road, slowly creeping up on his truck. An unpleasant feeling squeezed his heart, and he looked out the window. Not a single sign, not a single lamp. Chasing shadows, he did not notice how the navigator said again, "You are approaching your destination." This time its voice sounded insistent, as if it demanded something from him. Suddenly a sound was heard from behind that made his heart freeze. A strong rumble, as if someone was trying to follow him. He turned around, but there was nothing but blackness behind his truck. Alex focused on the road again, but the navigator, as if teasing him, said again, "You need to speed up." As he approached the mysterious waypoint, he noticed that figures were flickering outside the window that should not be there. The shadows on the side of the road seemed familiar, but he could not understand from where. Images of long-forgotten memories arose in his mind, old friends passing by. A strange feeling of longing filled his heart. As he made his way deeper into the night, he did not notice how the weather became more and more ominous. The smile of the night sky was covered with clouds when the navigator said, "Turn right in 200 meters. At that moment, he felt that something was wrong. Why could not he see the signs on this road? A faint light appeared on the horizon. He did not know what it was. The trucker felt anxiety seize him. His heart was pounding in his chest as he slowed down and looked toward the light. It was an old archway, revealing a cemetery immersed in darkness. "No," he whispered, but the GPS stubbornly continued, "Your final destination." Alex felt his body seize with the desire to run. But he had to finish the load, even though it seemed insane. He crossed the archway, and inside the cemetery everything changed. Each grave glowed with a ghostly light, as if the dead were waiting for him. The trees creaked, and the wind whispered names that Alex couldn't make out. His heart was pounding, as if trying to escape from his chest. Alex began to make his way through the cemetery, slipping between the graves and remembering a childhood full of laughter and friendship. In that moment, he realized that he was not only transporting cargo, but also his own memories. His thoughts raced from fear to memories of his losses, and every step seemed to trigger memories he would rather forget. Finally, he stopped. There was something in his van. He couldn't understand it. He opened the back door and froze in shock. There, among the bags and dark boxes, was a coffin. His coffin. There was a sign on the lid, and in the terrible light of the night, a date, a name, and a photograph, his own face. He felt a chill run through his body. This was his last journey, his last flight. Understanding came with the horror. He wasn't just carrying a coffin, he was carrying himself. This was the end of his journey, the end of a life he had never imagined. He was carrying his memories, his fears, and his dreams, now wrapped in a coffin. His GPS, which had led him into this nightmarish reality, finally spoke the last words. "You have arrived at your destination." Alex suddenly realized that he had no choice. He stood on the edge of the grave, and the night continued to surround him, as if waiting for him to take a step forward. Ray was a long-time truck driver, and night shifts had become an integral part of his life. In the dark, he felt fear, fewer cars, less stress, and the road always in front of him a smooth ribbon under the headlights. That night, he was hauling a large load on one of the lesser-known highways, where there was almost no traffic. Small drops of rain pounded the windshield when Ray noticed a figure on the side of the road, a man standing motionless with his hand raised. Passengers on the road were rare, but deep down Ray always considered himself an upstanding citizen. His father had once taught him, "Help those in need." Perhaps it was stupid in such times, but Ray stopped the truck, deciding to at least give the poor guy a ride to the nearest gas station. Having stopped the truck, he leaned towards the window to get a look at the stranger. The man was dressed in an old shabby raincoat, his face was hidden by a hood, and the hands in which he held a bag seemed unnaturally pale. "Where are you going?" Ray asked, straining a little. The stranger's voice was muffled, as if from afar. "Forward. Just forward." The answer was strange, but Ray did not ask unnecessary questions. He opened the door, and the stranger quietly got into the cabin, silently sitting down in the passenger seat. For a few minutes, silence reigned in the car, interrupted only by the sound of the rain and the windshield wipers. Ray tried to start a conversation. "Long night, huh? Working somewhere nearby?" The stranger did not answer. Ray felt the cold creeping up his back. It seemed that icy air was emanating from the man, although the heater in the cabin was on. He glanced at the passenger again. His face was hidden by a hood, but something about his figure caused concern. A couple of miles later, the strangeness of the situation intensified. The truck's headlights began to flicker, the taillights reflecting off the wet road in a ghostly line of lights. Ray swore under his breath, trying to ignore what was happening. He chalked it up to fatigue. "You wouldn't have stopped if you knew who I was," the stranger said suddenly. His voice was deep, cold, and emotionless, as if the words carried some old, forgotten threat. Ray froze, unsure how to respond. "What?" he muttered, turning to the passenger. The man sat motionless, his hands still clutching the bag tightly. The man slowly turned his head toward Ray, but his face remained in the shadow of his hood. Ray focused on the road again, not wanting to continue this strange conversation. He turned on the radio, trying to distract himself with music, but all the channels only picked up static. He glanced at the dashboard. The fuel was rapidly running low, although it had recently been almost full. The inner unrest grew stronger with each passing minute. After a while, another long straight appeared on the road. An old, rickety gas station flashed in the headlights. Ray felt relieved and turned towards it, deciding that he needed to take a break and fill up. "We'll stop," he told the passenger, expecting some kind of reaction, but the passenger only nodded, continuing to sit motionless. When they stopped, Ray noticed that the gas station looked abandoned. The light in the windows was dim, and there was no movement inside. Nevertheless, he decided to get out, fill up the truck and stretch a little. The stranger remained in the cabin, still not saying a word. Ray walked along the building, feeling how the air was getting colder despite the warm evening. Inside the gas station, through the dirty glass, he noticed the cashier, an old man with a gray face, who was sitting behind the cash register and staring into space. It seemed as if he had been there forever. Ray stepped toward the door, but at that moment he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around abruptly and saw his passenger standing by the truck, motionless, looking straight at him. Something about his posture seemed wrong, unnatural. "Hey, what's wrong?" Ray shouted, but only silence answered him. When he turned back to the gas station, the cashier had disappeared. In his place there was only a dusty counter and an old newspaper. Ray's gaze fell on the headline. "Truckers disappear on highway. No bodies found." The date of the newspaper was October 30th, exactly 30 years ago. Panic rose inside. He returned to the truck and, without wasting any time, got behind the wheel. The passenger was back in his seat, sitting silently, as if he had never left the cabin. "Do you know what this place is?" the stranger said. Ray nervously started the engine. The truck stalled. He tried again, but to no avail. The feeling that everything around him was trapped in time became tangible. "This isn't just a place. You're not the first to stop here, and you won't be the last." Ray tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The stranger slowly turned his head toward him, and in the dim light he finally saw his face, pale, gray, with empty, dead eyes. "They were all bringing things here that they weren't supposed to," the passenger whispered. "And now you are too." At that moment, the truck shook, as if something was moving underneath it. Ray realized that he couldn't leave here. He was a prisoner. A look fell on the dashboard, and where the distance to the destination, the date was now glowing. Ray realized that this was the day the other truckers had disappeared. The same night. And he was next. The truck's headlights went out, the engine died completely. The last thing Ray heard was the stranger's voice. "You're part of this now." The light went out, and darkness swallowed everything around.